Good evening, everyone. I'm Kiki Smith Archipati. I'm the acting director of the Association for Cultural Equity, and I would like to thank you all for joining us for another installment of Tradition Talks, our virtual speaker series, which highlights individuals who are approaching cultural heritage documentation in creative and impactful ways. I'm so pleased to welcome tonight's guest, Ian Nagoski, an independent music researcher and record producer from Baltimore. For more than 20 years, Ian's been uncovering and sharing the incredible early 20th century recordings made by immigrants to the United States. He's produced anthologies for labels like Dusted Digital, Tompkins Square, Mississippi Records, and his own Canary Records, which has released more than 150 digital albums. Tonight, he'll be exploring the forgotten history of early 20th century musical masterpieces recorded by immigrants and natives in this lecture listening party. If you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to use the chat to put them in, and we will potentially get to them at the end. Anyway, take it away, Ian.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to my basement in West Baltimore, Maryland. You can hear me okay? So, what I want to tell you is everything, but I can't. So I'm just going to be talking for a long time about a group of ideas and stories that I think have to do with this business of American music and the idea of American music, how we arrived at it, where it stands, where it might have gone, what we did to try to expand it over a certain period, and ways in which that worked and didn't work. So the hypothesis, I'm just going to read straight out. The United States of America's global economic, military, and hegemonic power during the period 1945 to 75 coincided with a definition of itself that resulted in a musical canon drawn from the blues, jazz, country, folk, rock, cultural continuum. That period in U.S. history included the second half of 4 decades rather, of radical immigration restrictions. Since 1975, efforts have been made to research and disseminate non-English language music produced in the U.S. during the first half of the 20th century. However, these efforts have had little impact on reshaping the broader cultural consciousness, both within the United States and abroad, about the vitality of multicultural, multi-ethnic America. As a result, the prevailing image remains one of an America divided simply into black and white, Christian and Jewish, overlooking the significant contributions that connect it to a wider world and leaving indigenous peoples nearly invisible in the cultural record. In John Cage's diary, How to Improve the World, You Will Only Make Matters Worse, he noticed the absurdity that in university classrooms, 200 people all read the same book, when 200 people can read 200 books. It is through repetition of a limited canon that American identity has been instilled across 10 million square kilometers and within 340 million people. The systemic failure of the U.S. to perceive itself accurately originates in centuries of underlying prejudices about the relative values of human life among people of different socio-ethnic economic identities. These have expression in legal terms of which legal terms of who or should be included as American. But a parallel history of cultural work operating on several levels has functionally deluded both the majority of Americans and many others to whom we have exported our self-image through our massive media output. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. In lieu of a land acknowledgement, we're going to start here. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his 1963 book, Why We Can't Wait. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which has tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated this tragic experience as a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it. Indeed, during the decade that followed World War II, a third of Hollywood's total cinematic output were westerns that endlessly repeated the image of the heroic settler in conflict with the forces of nature, of which the people who lived there was one. Okay. Today, I was going through some books, came across this strange thing, Our American Music, published in 1931, written by a guy named John Tasker Howard, who was born in 1890. He actually addresses the question of whether Native music is American or not. And he says, well, geographically it is, but of course it really has nothing to do with our music. It's a book I hadn't looked at in a decade because it's boring, because it's mostly about 19th century composers about whom I'm not particularly interested, but there's a passage that I will deal with momentarily. But study of folklore took root among academics and scholars from many disciplines in the US within a matter of the decades of its formalization in Northern Europe. And those interested in Native American music quickly employed the new technology of sound recording. Harvard and Leipzig educated born Bostonian zoologist Jesse Walter Fuchs and the swashbuckling prodigious Cornell dropout Frank Hamilton Cushing worked in Zuni Pueblo in present-day New Mexico, gathering sound specimens for wax cylinders. Of the same generation, Benjamin Ives Gilman, a New Yorker with degrees from Harvard and Johns Hopkins, took advantage of the gathering of representatives of many cultures at the World Columbian Exposition in 1893 in Chicago to make cylinders of musicians from Java, Fiji, the Ottoman Empire, and elsewhere, including indigenous groups from the U.S. Northwest and British Columbia. Even during the exponential expansion of commercial sound recording from 1890 to 1920, little commercial value was placed on Indian music, on Native American music. Victor Records issued 12 7-inch discs in 1904 by an Iroquois singer named Honu Ses, whose name I'm certainly pronouncing wrong. But they sold so poorly or were pressed in such minuscule quantities that there is only one complete run of them known. Victor rejected Victor Records, the two major record companies in the early 20th century, before World War II, Victor and Columbia. The larger and more prestigious of the two was Victor Records. Victor rejected all further trial performances cut by other native performers until the mid-20s, when they issued 3 discs during the period 1917 to 24 by a Penobscot singer named Lucy Pulau under her stage name Princess Wadawao, accompanied by performers on European instruments, including pianist and composer Thurlow Lawrence. Those 6 sides were issued from a total of 28 sides that she recorded. The overwhelming majority of her repertoire was rejected for release. Finally, I'm going to play you a record. So there's this interesting anomalous disc that was issued by Columbia, recorded June 23rd, 1913, by an anonymous group of Seneca Indians made in New York City, issued as part of an educational series. This is that disc. It was made for Columbia Records, Victor's competitor. Thing about Columbia was that, being Victor's competitor, they were always looking for business opportunities. And one of their business opportunities was that you could buy your way into their catalog, basically. They would record you and release a record if you paid them a certain amount of money. And they did go to churches and social organizations. And basically anybody with some money, they would make a record for you. So this Seneca record there's 2 sides. One is just titled Children's Chorus. We are anecdotally told that it is the Catechism of the Longhouse Religion, established by the prophet Handsome Lake. I'm again going to mispronounce his name. Ganyodayo, born 1735, died 1815, who wrote this code, developed this religion, the Longhouse religion, in 1799. The other side is credited as funeral song. Another anecdote relates that the melody is typical of funeral services, but the lyrics that were recorded were not in fact Seneca, but are in fact gibberish, such that the sacred text would not disseminate to non-initiates. I don't know for sure. Most native languages are, of course, endangered now. In 2007, of a population of 100,000 Seneca people, there were about 100 native speakers of the language left. So one story about the disc is that the people on it might have been involved in Wild Bill Cody's Wild West vaudeville show, Buffalo Bill Cody. In fact, Cody's company was at the time going bankrupt, but it is possible that some of the performers might have been involved in his stage show some decades earlier. They might have been old enough to have been a part of his touring troupe. In any case, the recording dates seem to coincide with a performance of Seneca people at a play of Hiawatha near New York City, right about the same time. Also coinciding with the disc's release was the publication 6 months earlier of an English language translation of the Code of Handsome Lake in the New York State Museum Education Department Bulletin by a guy named Arthur Caswell Parker, born 1881, died 1955, a folklorist of Native American culture whose father was half Seneca. So this disc, I think, speculation, was a personal project of his. So, yeah, get to hear a record, right? Anyway, um, there was a disc credited to Glacier Park Indians with a vocalist named Blackfoot, issued by Victor in 1914, which was in print off and on for decades, and a band in Texas called Big Chief Henry's Indian String Band, recorded for Victor in 1929. Otherwise, a dozen or so discs were issued by Janet and other smaller labels in the mid 20s, but overall, there are only several dozen commercially released discs available in the US of native music during the period 1905 to 1940, while there was a population of about 250,000 native people. In the 40s, a short-lived label in New Mexico targeted basically toward the modernist art scene in Taos, New Mexico. Georgia O'Keeffe and her circle produced some discs of native music for listening pleasure, but it wasn't really until the foundation of Canyon Records about 1950 by and for natives that there was a significant body of work well recorded and released. Canyon is still in business to this day, one of the longest running independent labels in the world. I'm going to play you disc that was one of the first things that Canyon ever released, about 1951 thereabouts, by a woman named Pop Chalee, who was born in Castlegate, Utah, March 20th, 1906. Her mother was Swiss and ultimately rejected her. She moved with her father to Taos in 1910, became a famous visual artist in the 1930s, died in 1993. It's just credited as a Tewa love song. I'm very fond of this record.
We bongi hui, hui bongi hui, hui bongi hui. Ha into hang we tuan you rang ku chalai na hey ma'am. Chalai na hate me, chalai na hate ma'am. Chalai na hate me, chalai na hate ma'am. Ha into
This is there's a substantial amount of show and tell that's going to go on here since I'm not a slideshow guy. Anyway, this is a Candelario album from about 1940 that was released in Taos. Beautiful painting by Gerard Naylor on the cover. Um, uh, right. So the idea of native people as part of America, the idea of native music in the US as part of American folk music is dismissed out of hand by, for instance, Mr. Howard in Our American Music. He compares native musics to Chinese music having nothing to do with Americanness. Now, Columbia University in New York, under the supervision of the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas, produced a significant number of ethnographers, including most famously Margaret Mead. Erica Brady's book, A Spiral Way, How the Phonograph Changed Ethnography, uh, points out that in the male-dominated field of anthropology, as it was becoming, many women made significant contributions during the first half of the 20th century to the documentation of native musics. She names Matilda Cox Stevenson, Helen Heffron Roberts, Alice Cunningham Fletcher, Elise Cluse Parson, Constance Goddard Dubois, Natalie Curtis Berlin, Helen Hartless Flanders, Gladys Amanda Richard, Theodora Kroeber, etc. You'll notice that none of them have really entered the popular imagination. Very few people are aware of the immense body of work made by this woman, Frances Densmore, who for 5 decades produced dozens of books and lots of recordings for the Smithsonian. None are at present commercially available. And the Smithsonian, like the Library of Congress, are poorly positioned to work with Indian authorities to negotiate the dissemination of ancestral native cultural work into the marketplace. A largely self-taught ethnomusicologist named Laura Boulton spent the second half of the 1930s recording in Africa and proselytizing among affluent white people for the appreciation of African music technology in hopes of introducing aspects of African music among Western composers. She commercially released an album of African recordings in 1939 and then released 2 albums of recordings that she made in Mexico, New Mexico, and Arizona of native performers. And they remained in print and were the best, most readily available sources for hearing native musics for decades. Commercial releases of native musics by the major record companies. Yeah, I already said that part. Okay, so Boulton, okay, I'm going to be in a lot of digressions here. I really like Laura Boulton. Not many people do, including some of the people who are responsible for her work today. One of the reasons for this has to do with aspects of the way in which her work was disseminated. She wrote a memoir in the 1960s. This is it. It's called The Music Hunter. It's a bad name for a book, particularly a book about somebody who um, goes to Africa and studies Africa. So hunting, catch and kill, you know, the safari idea. It's a bad look. And it's not a good book. It is dry. It is it contains no particular self-reflection. It contains very little mention of her use of technology, which is really too bad because she was a very sophisticated um, person in a lot of ways. Okay, this is she was born in Conneaut, Ohio, one of whatever it was, 8 children. Um, and to a farming family. She was trained as an opera singer. They spent a huge amount of money training her voice. She went to college. This is her own copy of the Victrola Book of the Opera, which was published her senior year of college. Her copy includes her own book plate, which shows her kind of an Edwardian dress with a bunch of sound technology on a table, right? That book plate was made in 1952. Um, so it's really too bad that uh, her memoir is not a great resource for her own work. Instead, what's a great resource are old newspaper accounts. Um, So the deal was that after college, she married a ornithologist. Her book, by the way, includes 2 paragraphs about her entire life up until the age of 30. Um, Her maiden name was Creighton. She marries this ornithologist named Boulton. Boulton gets a commission to go to Africa to collect specimens of birds. So they go in 1931 for the first time to Africa, and I beg your pardon, in 1930. They come back April 1930. The Pittsburgh Press, they were living in Pittsburgh at the time, announced their return home, saying that she had to be coaxed back to America. I hate to go back to dresses, she said. It was so restful to be away from the noise and rush of the 20th century in America. If I didn't think I could return to Africa someday, I believe I would want to die. She loved Africa. African music, African people. And she collected instruments on the first journey, but then in subsequent journeys, over the course of 1931, 33, she began bringing wax cylinder recording equipment, photography equipment, and then eventually um, she did these immensely productive trips 1933 to 34 under the auspices of the Field Museum of Natural History. These were ostensibly more to gather fauna from Africa, but she had a custom built uh, sound recording machine that was made by a guy named Walter C. Garwick of Columbia University, which cut directly onto uncoated durable aluminum 10-inch plates and ran on a battery. From February to August 1934, she cut a total of 367 performances. The total distance that she traveled during that trip was 8,500 miles and going all through West Africa. I mean, all through West Africa. I have here in front of me somewhere the exact countries: Mali, Nigeria, Togo, Ghana. I've forgotten. Um, so she comes back and she says, the music will be stimulating for modern composers. She says, uh, she's this kind of white society woman talking to the press and saying that she's very enthusiastic. The music of the African Negro is far reaching and has a positive influence on the world. It has definitely contributed to the artistic life of all of us. Africans have forgotten more rhythm rules than other civilizations have ever known, she says in 1938. Following year, she said that African rhythms are, quote, above our scope, and stated that African music suggests a basis for future developments for Western music. The front page of the Baltimore Afro-American in 1937 has a headline that says, Plays African Death Machine. And the first paragraph is this like totally crazy, ridiculous horror movie thing. Made in the dead of night by a secret process which no woman may see without being killed, a West African musical instrument was played before a London audience last week by a white woman, Mrs. Laura Boulton, lecturer in anthropology at the University of Chicago, in an address on West African music. The forbidden instrument is the ochisanji, which has metal keys made by a smith working at night. Okay, this is the mbira. This is kalimba, thumb piano, right? Marketed as a toy by Hugh Tracy decades later. Missed an opportunity, should have called it the African Death Machine. But after that paragraph, we get a direct quote from Laura Boulton, who says, for the last 250 years, our European musicians have been experimenting in the field of melody, but we have never more than scratched the surface in the field of rhythm. Maybe, just as certain forms of our present musics, such as symphony and sonata, evolved from the court dances of Europe, our future music may have African dances as its ancestor. So, she was a prophet, is what I'm saying. All right, I'm just going to play you real quick one of the recordings that she made May 1934 in Timbuktu, Mali. This is a Tuareg performance that, well, it's rather the fashionable thing now, isn't it? With all these Saharan groups touring the United States all the time. This was listed upon its release as a war song, not a war song. You'll forgive me for cutting off some of these performances. I generally try to keep things, play the whole performance to, the meaning of all of this is to dignify the lives and work of some of these musicians. But, well, short on time and too many stories, and, well, I'm being selfish, it's the fact of the matter. So, she spends years going around touring, playing these recordings, talking about Africa to Americans during the 1930s, second half of the 30s, all over Jim Crow America. 1939, she puts out this 6-disc album on Victor Records with quotes from Stokowski and Aaron Copland. She's actively trying to introduce African music to Western composers. That's her big mission. Now, it just so happens it comes out the end of 1939, the beginning of 1940, two things happen. She has an accident, she hurts her back, and she and her husband break up. She gets divorced. Big problem for her. She, by the way, in her memoir, never mentions her husband by name once. Writes him out of her story. So, some bad blood there. It was a very difficult period for her. Two of my close friends, brilliant women, she said, had become embittered and had gone to pieces when the continuity of their lives had been broken. I was determined this would not happen to me. So she decides to throw herself into work, attends a first Inter-American Congress on Indian Life held in Mexico, April 14th to 24th, 1940. A friend of hers, who was a trustee and founder at the Museum of Modern Art, commissioned her to produce an album of Mexican Indian recordings during her trip. She said, probably the hardest and certainly the loneliest thing I ever did in my life was undertaking this expedition. The first I ever organized completely on my own. Following the conference, she headquartered in an inn directly across the street from the studio of the painter Diego Rivera, who allowed her to photograph and record his collection of ancient instruments, pre-Columbian instruments that he collected. While Boulton worked, Rivera chatted with her as he worked on his portrait of the actress Paulette Goddard, who was then married to Charlie Chaplin. In late June, Rivera and Goddard fled Mexico in her private plane when Rivera was suspected of having been part of an assassination attempt on the life of Leon Trotsky, who had had an affair with Frida Kahlo, his wife, from whom he was currently separated. He was then sleeping with Paulette Goddard. In any case, on the recordings that she made in Rivera's studio, we know that it's his voice you can hear way in the background as she's tinkering with these instruments that he collected. So, for instance, okay, so there's your Hollywood gossip for this talk. Onward. So she then makes recordings at the National Museum in Mexico City before traveling to Merida, Yucatan. She records slit drums, blah, 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 accompanied by American ambassador Oscar Strauss, grandson of Boulton's patron Sarah Strauss, who had funded the African trips. She traveled to Puebla and Oaxaca to make recordings of ceremonial village music. She was especially impressed with the music of the Yaqui people in Puebla. When she traveled further north to Arizona, she encountered a Yaqui community who had migrated, who had been broken up by war. She played some of the recordings that she'd made in Puebla to them and saw her audience deeply moved, some weeping at the desire to return home. I'll play you one of those Yaqui recordings. Beautiful thing. So then she gets commissioned from the Canadian government to do recording there, and just continues following one job after another, producing ethnographic field recordings. She eventually does make it back to her beloved Africa much later in life. Okay, so onward. Oh, here, I'm going to play you another little recording while I tell you the next bit. This is Charles Kellogg. This is Charles Kellogg. He was a professional bird imitator, among other things. Inventor, wrote a book late in life, The Nature Singer, about this thing that he had learned how to do, where he could imitate various animals. He was a vaudevillian stage performer. And I play this because it was because of the frontispiece right here that I encountered a guy named Mercer, Henry Chapman Mercer. I'm going to turn this off because it's distracting me. During the 19th century, while studying archaeological evidence of pre-colonial native life in eastern Pennsylvania, Harvard-educated artist, collector, curator Henry Chapman Mercer noticed and became interested in a broader trend of vanishing America, industrialization and migration from rural agrarian life toward manufacturing hub cities were resulting in the extinction of hand manufacturing technology. By 1897, he'd begun to gather tools that had been used for centuries and were quickly becoming obsolete. 50,000 of them are now held in the museum that he built. Around the same time, a professor from Harvard and Johns Hopkins named Francis James Child, who had studied linguistics in Germany, published decades of research in a 5-volume anthology of 305 song texts titled English and Scottish Popular Ballads. During the period of their publication, 1884 to 1898, Child served as the first president of the American Folklore Society, which then concerned itself primarily with the preservation of African American and Native American folklore. In both cases, Mercer's Museum and Child's Ballad Anthology, there is inherently something magisterial and wonder-inducing. First, by the sheer scale and apparent time, effort, thoroughness given to their collection. Secondly, by their arrangement and potential meanings. One has the impression of something authoritative having been accomplished, although there is inherently an arbitrary aspect to the encounter with each object or text, but a rigorous approach and the will to follow each idea to its inclusion will impart a delicious experience to the audience. But what's left behind? What examples did not survive, and what or who is deemed unworthy for inclusion? Mercer's collection overtly stands in direct contrast to contemporary cultural shift in America and presents an antique and recent past side by side. Among the approximately 3,000 resources cited by Child in his bibliography that accompanies his ballads, one encounters some from the 17th century, a handful from the 16th, but overwhelmingly they are texts published in the 70 years preceding his own publication, and the vast majority precede his by only 20 or 30 years. The geographic and linguistic scope of Child's sources belie an attempt to use the British ballad to look deeper into the past through epics of migration, diffusion, variation. Folklorists working in the Appalachian Mountains later gave new meaning to Child's masterpieces, to his masterpiece, this giant collection of ballads. Around 1909, a Tufts-educated woman named Olivia Dame Campbell began collecting songs that she noticed were similar to the Child ballads, and showed them to the British folklorist Cecil Sharp, resulting in the 1917 publication of the book English Folk Songs from the Southern Appalachians, demonstrating the continuity between Child's work and the living traditions of American singers. In Child's lifetime, however, during the 19th century, the dominant American popular music included stage shows based explicitly on prejudicial stereotypes of black people by white people, appropriating instruments, banjos in particular, and aspects of performance and language of black people, enslaved and free alike. Minstrelsy embodied both bigoted hostility and revulsion of white performers and audience toward the sensibilities of relentlessly dehumanized African Americans, with a vaguer affection and admiration for them. The use of blackface in minstrelsy was a reduction of a group on the basis of skin color to depict stock characters, patronizing, affectionate, or abusive. Eventually, identification of whites with blacks was part of a complicated process of groups merging and dividing. Child referred to the musical interactions of differing European communities as, quote, races distinct in blood and history, at the same time that in the US, America was blurring its own racial boundaries as popular theater. The profound ubiquity of minstrelsy during the 19th century and the garish caricatures of black men and women in influential and best-selling stories like Uncle Tom's Cabin remained a largely unprocessed, whitewashed context for American musicality through both the 19th and 20th centuries, and therefore the present. For instance, the U.S. record business from the 1920s through the 1940s distinguished black performances as race records and rural white performers as hillbilly records. Record stores today still continue to segregate jazz from classical, rock, pop, and country from R&B, soul, and hip-hop on the basis of a presumed racial origin, although black and white performers have been popular and made contributions in the various categories that would have long ago negated these boundaries. Americans remain on high alert for ongoing evidence of racism in a state of largely sublimated shame, sorrow, and anger. The remains of the living legacy of the indecency of slavery and the nightmarish civil war in which half the country fought and died for its continuation. So, so this whole thing of minstrelsy in the 19th century is a part of American folk music that, is massively influential and is not discussed much in terms of the child ballads. That the child's work is in opposition to this major American kind of movement that had been going on for a very long time. In this, back to our American music, in one respect, the most surprising of the facts, once stated by Mr. Charles White, old Ethiopian comedian, which credits Mr. Gottlieb Graupner, a German immigrant in Boston, with being the father of Negro song. This Graupner is said to have sung the gay Negro boy in character, accompanying himself on the banjo at the end of the second act of a play, December 30th, 1799, at Federal Street Theater in Boston. This was Gottlieb Graupner, an oboist. In Boston, he led an orchestra at the old Federal Street Theater, kept a music shop, played the oboe, double bass, nearly every other instrument, organized the Philharmonic Society. Mr. Graupner's sojourn to Charleston in 1795 suggests that where he, a German, became acquainted with the banjo, and also offers evidence on the question mooted by Mr. Hutton whether or not the banjo was common among slaves in the South. So, yes. So the aspects of African technology enter into white performance in the United States. Okay, so child's work then is succeeded, unlikely enough, by a guy who wound up becoming a president of the American Folklore Society named John Lomax. He was born in Mississippi, 1867, raised on a farm in Texas where he developed a strong interest in cowboy songs. His education was hard-won, made it to the halls of Harvard in 1906, where child successor George Lyman Kitteridge encouraged him in his song collecting activities, resulting in the 1910 publication of his book, Cowboy Songs and Other Frontier Ballads. Among those who appreciated Lomax's book was the poet and journalist Carl Sandburg, who himself subsequently published a book in 1927 called The American Song Bag, which included minstrel and theater songs next to child ballads, blues, work songs, other folk material. In 1912, Lomax was made president of the American Folklore Society, 23 years after Child. Returning to Texas in the 20s, Lomax worked in a bank that failed in the wake of the stock market crash. In early 1932, he and his teenage son Alan visited the then new Archive of American Folk Song at the Library of Congress to do research for a new book of American folk songs that they co-authored. The library helped the Lomaxes get disc recording equipment for field work in exchange for their results going into the archive's holdings. He ultimately collected over 10,000 songs from a variety of ethnic groups, including material in Spanish and French, as well as performances on islands in the Caribbean. John Lomax and all four of his children, his second wife, were associated with the library for decades. Alan Lomax's prolific recording and publishing work extended his father's. A 20-page mimeographed document produced by 25-year-old Alan Lomax in 1940, revised in 1942, simply titled List of American Folk Songs on Commercial Records, named 350 commercial records made in the 1920s and 30s that Lomax was able to find. The Sandberg book, American Songbag, was the first exposure of the child ballads to one particular hyper-literate kid in Washington State named Harry Smith. Harry Smith, at the age of 17, had ingratiated himself with academics in native Lumi, Samish, and Swinomish communities such that he could attend and document exclusive ceremonies. As a teenager with a strong interest in anthropology, he encountered discs by Southern Black performers, Memphis Minnie, Reverend F.W. McGee, Tommy McLennan, Yank Ratchell, leading him to compulsively collect records that were, he said later, exotic in relation to what was considered world high-class music. After a year and a half studying anthropology at the University of Seattle, he moved in 1946 to Berkeley, California, joining its nascent experimental cinema and art scene, and collecting a total of 20,000 discs, amassing not only blues, hillbilly, gospel, but also Cajun, Trinidadian, Romanian, Irish, Mexican, Japanese records, the latter drawn significantly from the collections of Japanese American citizens who'd abandoned them when they were incarcerated as potentially dangerous enemies during World War II. When he relocated to New York in 1951, he only brought about 10% of that collection. Living as an abstract painter and filmmaker, as a disaffected bop hipster, Smith was desperately broke and a user of every mind-altering drug he could get his hands on. He approached Moses Ash, who had recently established the Folkways Records label. Smith hoped to sell his finely honed record collection for some quick cash. Ash declined, but suggested that Smith produced an album for Folkways drawn from his collection, and what Smith produced was guided primarily by both his prodigious knowledge and his superb ear. So influenced by the Alan Lomax 1940 list and Child's books, 28-year-old Smith produced 3 2-LP sets comprised of 84 performances dubbed from commercial discs, all issued between 1926 and 33, pirated without license from the rights holders. He placed 5 child ballads as the opening tracks of the first volume, sequencing them in the same order they'd been on Child's books. It was designed for musicologists, and Smith infused it with humor, surrealism, and references to esotericism, giving it the appearance of something eternal found in the specific. He envisioned it as 4 volumes, each connected with the Aristotelian elements of earth, air, fire, and water. But the 4th volume was never completed. It sold mainly to libraries, where it languished for several years before leftist American folkies noticed it and adopted it as a resource for their own repertoires. So versions performed and recorded during the decade 1956 to 66 by educated young men in wide belts and work shirts and waifish serious women in black turtlenecks and long ironed straight hair, spread into the homes and coffee houses of the US and UK as emblems of the art of working class and dreamlike visions of an American antiquity that was unknowable. Among all that's been written about the Smith set, particularly since its 1997 CD reissue by the Smithsonian and canonization as a touchstone, what is never mentioned is what it does not include. It does not include recordings by immigrants, Jews, American Indians, Native Americans, all of which Smith was well aware. He considered the 3 LP set of Kiowa peyote songs that he later recorded for Folkways to be superior to his anthology for good reason. Structure and methods are more careful, thorough, and detailed. I reject, he later said of the anthology, that entire approach to music. Things that happened more than 30 years ago or something about the statute of limitations, I can no longer be held responsible for having put that thing together the way it was put together. The year before Smith's anthology, Folkways issued the first volume of a series of 2 LP sets compiled and annotated by the composer Henry Cowell, based on a class he taught at the New School for Social Research in the early 30s called Musics of the World's Peoples. That project originated in a fertile, visionary period of Cowell's work, coinciding with the publication of his seminal 1930 book, New Musical Resources, from which one can trace nearly the whole of 20th century avant-garde music. All of Fluxus and minimalism sort of comes from Cowell, as well as this whole thing of like far out musicians looking toward foreign resources. Meanwhile, So any serious jazz or classical musician during the 1950s and 60s, as a result of the efforts of people like Laura Boulton, as a result of the Folkways Ethnic series, can go to the library now and read and have a firsthand listening experience of musics that have different structures from what's available in the Western music. Arguably, the most influential thing coming out of this period, the 50s and 60s, is this Alan Lomax book, Folk Songs of North America. This thing sold like crazy. 1960 it comes out. I want to point out that there's a page at the back, an appendix, page 608, which is it calls itself a discography. It's not that. It's just a few paragraphs where he mentions some records that you should hear. He says that it's better to hear records by authentic singers, than these folkniks. And, he mentions the Harry Smith anthology. He mentions some record distributors and labels. In big capital letters, there are two names. I don't know if you can see them there, but they say Little Walter and Muddy Waters. Okay, this is 1960 this comes out. Now, meanwhile in England, in opposition to the stiff, sentimental, comforting music of their parents' British adolescence during the period 1954 to 57, this children from the baby boom adopted what they saw as a kind of primitive American jazz that required little skill or knowledge. The short-lived skiffle genre had its biggest hit with Lonnie Donegan's version of Rock Island Line, a song originally recorded by John and Alan Lomax for the Library of Congress at Cummins State Farm Prison in Arkansas, subsequently re-recorded in 1937 by Leadbelly, whom the Lomaxes met at Angola Penitentiary in 1933. Among many other teenagers, one group of working-class kids in Liverpool started a skiffle group, calling themselves first the Quarrymen and then the Beatles. Following the international success of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, the Everly Brothers, Little Richard, etc., around 1956 to 60, the glamour and intensity of American rock and roll faded quickly on the charts into a procession of pretty boys who were rejected by a cross-section of British kids in favor of music that felt more authentic, blues and folk. So 1961, 1962, young Americans, Paul Simon, Bob Dylan, go to England and encounter Martin Carthy, for instance, who'd gone through the skiffle thing and was now digging deep into the old ballads. One group of middle-class London record obsessives who were buying these imported Little Walter Muddy Waters discs earned a good living imitating their style and naming their band for one of Waters' songs, the Rolling Stones. So the subsequent reimportation of a cross-section of American ethnic vernacular music into the US through Beatles, Stones, Who, those guys, British Invasion, gave white American teenagers, again, people born 1946 to 52, who were like kids, who had lived in the context of racial segregation, enforced or de facto, the sense that they could have a safe experience of crossing the painful line of race without any special knowledge and participate in a relatively unified America for the duration of a song at least. The British invasion gave them records that could be judged on the quality of their character, not color of their skin. Between the two world wars, jazz had made inroads through Europe, much of the global south, escaping North America on discs, as tango had done from its own birthplace. When the U.S. State Department sent tours of jazz ambassadors, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Dave Brubeck, Dizzy Gillespie, Benny Goodman, to tour South Asia, the Near East, Eastern Europe during the period 1955 to 57 to demonstrate American values of dignity, freedom, individuality, racial integration. Meanwhile, the values of rock and roll, volume, economy, youth, and uncloaked libidinal energy, made it to all parts of the world very quickly without any government funding. The near universal nod of agreement in North America and Europe toward the audio productions of Tamla Motown, Sun Records, Chess Records, gave birth to at least two generations of a logical, if that, then this, aesthetic expansion. This led to a broad rear-view recognition, distribution, appreciation of productions like the Smith Anthology, the Lomax material, and the obsessive research of several waves of more or less amateur record collectors, so long as they seemed to refer back to the Chuck Berry, Elvis, Little Richard, Dylan, Beatles, Stones cataclysm of 1955 to 65 that ran parallel to the civil rights struggle in the United States. So researchers and collectors developed massive bodies of work related to the antecedents of the music that were the building blocks of rock and roll, paying special attention to the early 20th century disc recordings. The overwhelming majority of those projects were undertaken by networks of dedicated amateurs. But when buying collections or hunting at junk sales, the material culture that they encountered that was not relevant to the main narrative, the developing canon, simply went over one shoulder like misshapen fruit. Heaps of black preachers and Jubilee Quartet records, genres that significantly outsold blues and jazz during the 1920s and 30s, were discarded into the trash in the search for precious Fletcher Henderson and Bix Beiderbecke records. Ours, after all, is a land of plenty. Oh dear. So many words. So in order to tell you the next part, I have to give you a little lesson in the history of immigration to the United States. There are, we say we're a nation of immigrants, but prevailing attitudes towards immigrants have always fallen into kind of three broad categories that have waxed and waned in relation to one another since the foundation of the country. You've got Anglo assimilation, where the immigrants should become as much like the descendants of the British colonists of the 17th century, adopting their language, customs, attitudes as quickly as possible, dispensing with vestiges that they brought from their own homes and thereby becoming American. The melting pot. Number two, new arrivals with their own traditions and values will settle along native-born people, and over time, each will take on aspects of each other's ways of living. Over generation, these blurred differences will then result in Americanness. Third, cultural plurality, what we called in the 90s multiculturalism. Cultural groups will live side by side, won't be any harm to one another, and work collaboratively on becoming American in our own ways, even if we largely retain our respective cultural specificities. Okay, power dynamics of immigration were evident from the outset in the voting rights laws established after the Constitution's ratification. 1790, male new arrivals who were free and white and of good character could vote immediately upon arrival. In some states, immigrants were initially required to own land in order to vote. But 5 years later, the law was revised to impose a 5-year waiting period before you could vote. Just 3 years after that, the requirement was extended to 14 years. But by 1802, this was deemed excessively harsh, and the waiting period was reduced back to 5 years. This initial back and forth movement in the distribution of democratic power, along with the disenfranchisement of Black, Native American, and female populations, is indicative of the ongoing struggle of the dominant in and out group powers. In the early 1920s, America had a big hit song recorded by at least 7 different performers, expressing the widespread anxiety of the perception of a threatening demographic shift. Its US version began with a little history lesson. Columbus discovered America in 1492. Then came the English and the French, the Scotsman and the Jew. Then came the Dutch and the Irishmen to help the country grow. And still they keep on coming, now everywhere you go. It's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. Later verses portray the exotic, dark-eyed newcomers as rent collectors, drivers of the best cars, as overcrowding the subways. New immigrants were described as both a bit repulsive and as replacing us. One verse later conveys sexual anxiety about women choosing them as partners and bearing their children. Later, a grudging admiration is shown for the earnestness of the new arrivals' determination to become American. They don't know the language, they don't know the law, yet they vote in the country of the free. Now the funny thing, when we start to sing, my country 'tis of thee. None of us know the words but the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. All right. North America was divided among 3 empires in the 18th century, Spanish, French, English, of whom 2 were Catholic. The British settler colonialists, Catholicism was viewed as a significant problem, and the 1774 British Quebec Act, in which George gave rights to the French Catholics in British Columbia, was among the causes of the American Revolution. Papists, as they were called, were disenfranchised from voting until the Revolutionary War. Meanwhile, Jews were banned from New France and much of the Spanish territories of North America, but Jewish congregations derived initially from Sephardic populations originating in Holland were established in 12 of the 13 British colonies. By the middle of the 19th century, restrictions from holding public office and suffrage without a public declaration of faith in the Trinity were repealed gradually, state by state, with equal political rights established in the overwhelming majority of the country. Anti-Semitism became a more significant problem in the 19th century when Jews from the Prussian and Austro-Hungarian empires arrived en masse. Mohammedans were a tiny minority of immigrants and remained largely covert. Approximately 100,000 Ottoman Muslims arrived between 1820 and 1920, but the overwhelming majority came in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. It was widely known among them that they stood a better chance at entry through the port of Boston than New York, where they were routinely turned away. A Turkish community had been established around Peabody, Massachusetts in the early 20th century, but they found America so inhospitable that they largely returned home in the late 20s. The first Syrians to arrive in 1870 were the subject of immense curiosity, having come from the Holy Land, and were welcomed as highly educated Christians. But 2 decades later, Syrians' legal racial status as white or non-white, affecting their petitions for citizenship, was called into question in a series of court cases during the period 1907 to 15. Their whiteness was finally legally established not on skin tone, but on shared Christian cultural heritage. Before the American Revolution, the dominant power in Pennsylvania was Quakers, who were pacifists and therefore could not wage war on the native populations of the western frontier. The Presbyterian Scots, who had settled in Ulster County of Ireland, had a reputation for being hardy and willing to fight, so 100,000 of them were encouraged to migrate and make their way west, where many settled in the Appalachian Mountains, retaining a dismissive attitude toward the earlier colonists in the relatively cosmopolitan East Coast. The Scots-Irish adherence to old ways, cultural conservatism, the ability to survive in difficult terrain, became linked to a God, guts, and guns mountaineer stereotype that was subsequently embraced by a stream of American culture. The image of the 19th century westward expansion into the plains and beyond became associated with cowboys, denim, the gold rush, and the eventual fusion of the ideas of the hillbilly and the cowboy was then marketed in the middle of the 20th century as country western music. Between 1840 and 1900, 5 million German speakers arrived in the U.S. By 1900, 4% of the total population was German speaking. Among them were we'll skip that part. Then when a wave of 3 million Irish Catholics arrived during the period 1840 to 1890, the established Protestant power structures reacted with a violent nativism. In the port city of Baltimore, Maryland, where Catholicism had been historically tolerated, nativists employed street gangs to terrorize immigrants and instigated citywide Election Day riots from 1854 to 1858, resulting in hundreds being severely wounded in hours of open gunfire, dozens killed, and electoral victories for the nativists. The language of Americans continues to include a basis in broad centuries-old categories of race expressed in terms of color. Legally, these designations have been obfuscated since the passage of the 14th Amendment in the wake of the Civil War, and yet they still exist in American speech and consciousness. Prejudicial assumptions based on widespread ignorance of cultures and histories of most of the world continue to be characteristic of American unease. In 1882, the Federal Chinese Exclusion Act barred people from China from entering the U.S. and denied Chinese residents from becoming citizens, justified by the belief that Chinese people were by their nature pagans and monarchists and therefore incapable of assimilation into American society. The law was not overturned until 1943, when the untenable hypocrisy of its racial bias had become a source of justifiable derision by the Axis powers. Similar prejudicial assumptions based on widespread ignorance continue to be characteristic of this. So, aggressive profit-seeking by the robber barons of the steel, railroad, coal, and oil industries recruited cheap labor between 1880 and 1920, bringing a major part of the 25 million people who arrived from Europe, about a third of whom were from southern Italy, another third were from Eastern Europe. Demographic flood of dark-eyed, non-Protestant immigrants is exactly what led to this wave of xenophobic anxiety expressed in the Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks. The same fears were expressed by the adoption of the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924, which set quotas for the number of people allowed to immigrate and naturalize as citizens based on their nation of origin. The initial numbers were derived from census data in 1880, preceding the wave of Italians and Slavs, in an overt attempt to reset the American demography to a permanent and incontestably white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. The exact numbers were adjusted periodically, but for instance, at the outset, 51,272 Germans were allowed in. Great Britain and Northern Ireland, 34,007. Poland, 5,982. By contrast, Portugal, 503. Armenian, 120. Syrian, Egyptian, Bulgarian, Greek, Palestinian, Albanian, 100 each. One scholar who testified 4 times at the congressional hearings of the Committee on Immigration and Naturalization between 1920 and 28 was a Princeton-educated eugenics researcher named Harry F. Laughlin, whose life work was a data-driven analysis of the populations of prisons and mental hospitals across the U.S., in which he claimed to have proven that Southern and Eastern Europeans were vastly more inclined toward criminality and feeble-mindedness, as it was called then, than Northern Europeans, and represented a threat to the breeding stock of the United States. Here's a protest song recorded in 1926 by a guy named Nishan Keljikian, who arrived in 1911. It's called Ouskeh Gukas, Where Do You Come From? The lyrics in Armenian were translated by my friend Harry Kazelian. Among them are, "Oh, my America, open the closed door. My fiancé is still on the other side. Where did you come up with this quota? Oh, my America, are you the only one who doesn't get it? The Armenian language isn't going to harm you. When we start to speak broken Armenian, the melting pot is ready for us. You sent money and missionaries. You made us so polrod." It's a slur for Protestant. "Come and be of aid to us. We are not foreigners to you." Because you see, it broke up families. People who were refugees, people in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide, who were stuck. Now, the door he mentions is a direct reference to the New Colossus, a poem written in 1883 by Emma Lazarus, installed as a bronze plaque at the base of the Statue of Liberty. "Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp," cries she, "with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." The key text to America's self-image as a nation of immigrants. But what is not widely known by most Americans is all the rest of this stuff. 2013, in an interview with a guy named Dick Spotswood, discographer, researcher, reissue record producer, he remembered that in 1972, a Finnish music researcher named Pekka Granau wrote an article for a specialist folk music journal called the John Edwards Memorial Fund Quarterly, where he said, quote, basically he was making the case that people who enjoyed hearing backwoods hillbilly music were missing out on some things that by not paying attention to the early records in the U.S. foreign language series. And I made a mental note of that. Spotswood is already steeped in all the aspects of collecting American folk music, research, publication, made a bunch of records in the 60s, and he took that mental note from Granau and ran with it to the extent that he produced a bunch of books and hundreds of reissue albums over the course of the 70s, 80s, 90s. And in particular, in the 70s, he was asked by the Library of Congress to produce a 15-album series funded by the National Endowment of the Arts for the bicentennial of the American Revolution. The resulting series was called Folk Music in America, issued between 1975 and 1981, each one themed by subject. Here, I'll show you. I only have about half of them. Yep, they look like this. So each one is themed by subject matter and drawn from blues, country, gospel, native, and immigrant performances. All the performances fit a down-home aesthetic. earnest, unpretentious, played by people whose technique tended to be more handed down than trained. What wasn't included were folksers in the sense of uh, uh, the performer, not a sociological adjective. There's no Odetta, Sigurd, Armenian, Trinidadian, Ukrainian, Amish, Greek, etc. performances, all made in America. The Popular Music magazine of the leftist acoustic music era, Sing Out, dismissed the set. The staff of the library, Spotswood said, weren't too crazy about it either and quietly let it go out of print. It has remained unavailable for 40 years except as pirated MP3 rips. In their heart of hearts, Spotswood later witheringly said of the library, who was its custodians, they'd rather hear Burl Ives. In the process of researching the series, Spotswood, with the imprimatur of the library, was able to go into the archives of the major American record labels and found that Granow's hunch was in fact a gold mine. Began to gather and organize data on the vast quantities of non-English language material made in the U.S. during the first half of the 20th century. In '82, he edited a book for the library titled Ethnic Music. Where is it? Oh, yeah. Ethnic Recordings in America, a Neglected Heritage. Chapter 1 was written by Granow, who by then had done amazing research showing that, for instance, during the period 1908 to 1940, hundreds of thousands of performances in dozens of languages had been made primarily in New York, secondarily in Chicago, a few other places, by and for immigrants. The majority of them having been issued by the two major record companies, Victor and Columbia, and that during the 19 teens and 20s, while Columbia's general English language series, the A series, American series, amounted to about 50,000 titles, while during the same period, its general foreign language series, the E series, the European series, came to about 6,000 titles. So, preceding the first commercial recordings of American folk vernacular music, from which Lomax Smith and the subsequent folk music establishment had kind of built its idea of old-time Americana, preceding the passage of the quota-based immigration system, more than half of the non-classical music being released by one of the two major record companies in America was in languages other than English. And this is to say nothing of the dozens of smaller, shorter-lived labels founded by immigrants themselves. An immense body of work. By dint of his training as a librarian, his access to all this material, Spotswood began diligently to gather data collected in the foreign language material, resulting in a 1990 publication of 5 volumes titled Ethnic Music in America, a discography of ethnic recordings produced in the United States, 1893 to 42. This functioned as an indispensable raw data roadmap through the leftover material culture of non-English language American records for anyone interested. Question became, who's interested? Not Dylan fans, not many academics who'd built their careers on filling in the gaps or parsing and analyzing previous research, and not the competitive subculture of acquisition-obsessed collectors who'd built their own dream worlds of bests of blues, jazz, and country in their basements. By the 90s and 2000s, there was not only a huge body of material written about the antecedent performances of the music that became popular in post-World War II America, but also a growing body of literature about the tastemakers who introduced those performers to a broader white audience. Okay. Blues, jazz, country collectors. Dear, oh dear. I need to wrap it up. Let's see. How should I do that? Yeah, so to give you an idea, here's the kind of thing that collectors of, whoops, it's not the one I meant. The kind of things that Granow pointed out that blues, jazz, country people were missing out on by not listening to the immigrant material. This is the only recording ever made by a guy named Marko Źeliznyj. So I want to just mention a few other people who've been important in this project of trying to introduce foreign language material into the idea of America. One is a guy named Chris Strawitz, who had been born into Prussian nobility in present-day Poland, just as Marko Źeliznyj was born in present-day Poland, although he worked as a coal miner in Pennsylvania, in the anthracite coal mines. Strawitz was raised under the Nazi regime, and like Pekka Granow and Spotswood, saw the intrinsic value of ethnic discs as early as the 70s. Having survived World War II, his family fled the Russian invasion to the US in 1947 when he was 16. Immersed in jazz, especially devoted to Texas blues singer Lightnin' Hopkins, Strawitz founded a label called Arhoolie in 1960 that was among the first and best of many independent companies to present living vernacular music of the American South, particularly focusing on Texas and Louisiana. Unlike many other labels, it turned a profit and stayed in business for decades. Parallel to Spotswood's work for the Library of Congress, Strawitz established a subsidiary label from Arhoolie called Folk Lyric, which from 1975 to 2011 reissued ethnic and mostly non-English language 78 RPM era recordings of Tex-Mex, Hawaiian, Irish American, Ukrainian American, Greek, Cajun, Cuban, Czech Bohemian, Texan, gospel blues, and jazz and other traditions, all with great sound, great notes, wonderful stuff. His collection of 125,000 Spanish language recordings, including 17,078 RPM discs made in the US and Mexico between 1905 and 1955, is now at the University of California, Los Angeles, where a massive searchable online resource was established in 2001. This is especially valuable since Spanish language record production during the first half of the 20th century was by far the greatest of any language group, outnumbering all recordings in Dutch, French, German, Italian, and Polish combined, while at present, Spanish speakers are currently under constant threat from the administration's immigration and deportation policies. I'll just give you, this is a volume 4 of the Spotswood discography. This is all Spanish language material recorded between about 1900 and 1940. I don't know any of this stuff. And this is my favorite thing. So there's a lot to explore, and there's so much available through the Frontera collection now. I'll play you one little thing just real quick before we go. This is a record made in southern Texas by a guy about whom we know nothing. Apparently it's his only record. I bought it in Texas some years back because one side, it turns out, is called Cheap Kisses, and the other side is called La Penicilina, penicillin. So maybe one is related to the other. But wonderful little record from around McAllen, Texas. And we got to leave on a happy song, right? Well, shucks, there's so much more that I would love to say and love to share with you. The song was composed by a guy named Erasmo Jackson Ruiz, born January 29th, 1929 in El Capote Ranch, Texas. He died at 82 years old in 1974. We don't know the actual identity of the primary performer, who's credited as Bocho Vidrios, which is apparently some sort of pseudonym. This is apparently the only record they made. It is part of the Frontera collection. There's lots more where that came from. So there are many other contributors who warrant mentioning. Ethelyn Rame and Martin Koning's Balkan Arts Center, renamed the Center for Traditional Music and Dance, the work of Pat Conte, a bunch of other people. But, well, shucks, you've all been very patient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. That was wonderful. We're gonna have to have you back to, expand on like I love that little, the Frontera collection, the piece from that. That was, yeah, that was great. Um, I don't think we have any questions, so we are.
Okay. We can go to bed.
I think you answered all the questions that anyone might have had. I think we will try to get the names of the songs that you played and try to get those credited within the video, which we'll be posting later, so that, people can refer if they need to. There were some, I can't remember the exact examples, but the second song I think you played that was very plaintive, that one was especially lovely. I'm gonna
Oh,
have to,
good.
yeah. Anyway, thank you again. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And we'll see you again soon.
Thank you very much. Be well.